Good morning, class. I'm going to walk through a little bit of week one. We're probably going to talk a little bit more about Kate Chopin's The Story of an Hour. Hopefully, you had a chance to read that. um, but just to sort of give you a basic rundown of how week one looks like, right? You have basically from Monday, the 24th of August, until Sunday, the 30th of August, to complete all the reading and the work that is needed to be turned in. Um, so if you look here, I'm already in our Blackboard page. I already clicked on the week one folder. Um, I will probably talk a little bit more about the fiction essay, maybe toward the end of this particular presentation, or maybe when we discuss. Everybody should have received some Teams request about a lecture meeting or a virtual meeting this Wednesday. I believe it's from like 4 to 5:30 or so. So we may talk a lot more about it then when we talk a little bit more about the Hemingway piece as well. Um, so just keep in mind, you can download it, you can read about it. It could be one of those things too that we really talk about next week a little bit more in detail, since we've only read the first two stories for week one. So let's sort of look at what I have here, right? We have the fiction essay, which again, you can download it and read it. Fiction elements, we'll talk about that here momentarily. Guided reading questions about Chopin and Hemingway. Again, as I said earlier in the video, these are just really for your own understanding. Obviously, you can, once you read the stories, you can answer those. And if you want to send me, hey, am I going in the right track? I could provide feedback for that. You don't necessarily have to turn those in to get a grade. They're just mainly there to see how much did you really comprehend from reading the story. Um, they are really good study techniques as it relates to the upcoming quiz for both the Chopin and the Hemingway piece, which is due by Sunday, the 30th, which you should be able to see that at the bottom of this page if you scroll down. Just keep in mind, once you click on a quiz and click begin, you have to basically sit there and do it. I think there's a time limit. It might be 30 minutes, might be 45. It could be possibly an hour. I have to go back and check that. But really, it's one of those that there's 10 questions. This particular one, I think, is a multiple choice quiz. It shouldn't take you really all day or all week to do. If you read the two stories, you know, provided notes with those guided reading questions, took notes, answer those questions to your best of your ability, listened and looked at some of the other slideshows and videos that are up here. It should just be one of those quizzes that, you should be able to do within a 30-minute time frame, if not less. If you read the stories, then again, you should be able to pick up the right answer relatively quickly. If you didn't read the stories and you are trying to do the quiz, it may be a little bit more difficult and your time might run out, because I know, just like everybody else knows, it is an online course. So you're probably going to try to use other avenues, right, to try to find your answers. Which really, when it comes to the exam, you're not going to necessarily have those avenues to travel down. So you can use notes and that type of stuff if you want, but when it comes to writing the essay and taking that exam one, we're going to really know who read the stories or not. So just keep that in mind. All right, so let's look real quick about the fictional elements. I'm going to click on this, and again, I'm not going to go through, read verbatim everything here because it's nearly 21 pages. We don't have that time. But I know our OER textbook doesn't really do a really good job on, talking about some of the elements of fiction. There's a lot of elements of fiction. A lot of the elements here we may never even, cover. But I think this is a good way to start looking at fiction, right? Narrative point of view. Is it first person? Is it second person? Is it third person? So you have different types of point of view to consider while you're reading some of these stories. And we'll talk about some of those while we do some of our discussions and that type of stuff. We also have other components, right, of fiction, which would be the setting. Is it local color? Is it regionalism? Where is it located? What time is it taking place? Is it taking place in the present? Is it taking place in the past, sometime in the 17th or 18th century? Is it taking place in the future? That type stuff. Is it taking place at a school, in the woods, on a boat? Just things that you should be able to recognize right off the bat. A lot of this stuff too applies not only to short fiction but also drama, movies, and poetry in a lot of ways as well. Plot and structure, right? Conflict, order, divisions, flashback, foreshadowing, a lot of this stuff, resolution, suspense, motifs. So again, a lot of this stuff that you would see in drama, you'd see in movies, you'd see in episodic TV shows, you also see in novels and short stories. Right? What is the climax of this particular short story, or what is the climax of this novel, or what is the conflict in the drama, or what is the subplots and the backstory in a particular episode of a TV show? So you see a lot of these things. But again, this is one place that you would probably want to start. Again, when it talks about characterization, we're going to talk a little bit more about Miss Mallard's characterization here momentarily. But you have a lot of different terms that you probably want to look at: protagonist, antagonist, right? Foil, confidant. So I'm just going to leave this there because obviously, right, we're only on page 11 when I was scrolling through this. So you have a lot here to look at. Do you have to remember every single thing that you read on this page? No. But it would be a good thing to start and look at, especially if you're looking at some of those guided questions and there's certain key terms about characterization or about tone or attitude. You probably want to come to this page, especially if you don't know what the question is really asking you to look for. So definitely look at this, scroll down, take notes on where you need to take notes. It'll be a good technique or a good study guide to sort of have, or a good handout to have as we go through the next 4 weeks when we deal with fiction. So I'm going to click out of that and go back to our week 1, and I'm going to pull up a little bit about Kate Chopin. As you can tell, she was born February 8, 1851, St. Louis, Missouri, and she died on August 22nd, 1904, in St. Louis, Missouri. She's one of the big American novelists and short stories writers of the 20th century, 18th, 19th century, really. But she had a revival of interest in the late 20th century because of her concerns about the freedom of women, foreshadowed late and later feminist literary themes. And you could probably see a little bit of that when you look into the story in an hour, how the lifestyle of being a woman during her time is definitely different, right? 18th, 19th century. Women really didn't have too many roles. They had the role of being a daughter. They had the role of being a wife and a mother, right? And we see that with Miss Mallard. There's something really troubling there with her as we go through that story of an hour, that she's being suppressed, right? Is she being suppressed by Mr. Mallard? Is she being suppressed by a male-dominant society, which a lot of folks would say yes, right? Because Mr. Mallard sort of represents that male-dominant society back during, the late 18th, 19th century of, when this story took place. She married, 1870, she married Oscar Chopin, who was a native of New Orleans. That's why, some of her other novels, like her first novel in 1890 was At Fault. We have other stories like Desiree Baby. And of course, one of the big ones that, most folks have read novel-wise is The Awakening, which she published in 1899. Deals a lot with the Creole and Cajun people in and around, Louisiana. So a lot of times her movement or her style, as you can tell here, is local color. And when you go down here and look at that, what does that really mean? It sort of fits those type of people, or that particular locality and those who dwell there during that particular time period. So as you tell here is a style of writing derived on that particular Creole, New Orleans, that mixture of people around that time period in that particular state or that location. Um, Otherwise, she wrote a lot, right? It says here she crafted short stories of which she wrote more than 100. So you might have read some, other short stories from her. Maybe in high school, you might have read something maybe in 1101 at some point. But she was really one of those first women that sort of broke the barriers of um, being a woman writer and being a very successful one during that time period. If we click over and actually look at some of the text, and this is the actual story. Now you can find the story online, but you can also find it um, in your online textbook as well. So when we look at this, one thing that we need to sort of keep in mind is the title of the story, right? The story of an hour. What does that mean? In a lot of ways, right? It's really the time that it takes for Louise Mallard, or Miss Mallard, as she's usually mostly referred to throughout the story. She hears at the very beginning, right, from her sister and her friend's husband, or friend rather, Richards, that there's been some sort of a tragic accident, right? Railroad accident dealing with Brentley Mallard. Supposedly he has died, right? As we read to the very end of the story, we realize there's a little twist there, and we will get to that here momentarily. But it's really the time period that when Miss Mallard hears from her sister Josephine and Richards about her husband's potential death to the very end, that we see Mr. Brantley or Mr. Mallard come through the door, and basically she sort of has that heart attack or that death that comes about her. So it's really one of those stories that it's really short, as you can tell. It's only about a page or so long. So it sort of emulates how long an hour would be, maybe one, right? One page, 1 hour, 60 minutes, that type deal. Again, going back to some sort of the terminology that literary critics use, right? We have to realize that Miss Mallard is our protagonist. She's our main character. And a lot of times when folks think of protagonists, they always say, well, it's the hero, the heroine. And usually that is the case. But, as we read through, I don't know how many people would really consider Miss Mallard a hero here or heroine, right? But another way to look at protagonist is the main character or the main focus the narrator usually devotes to as a character throughout the story. One thing that we need to kind of keep in mind that this particular story during the 1890s was a really controversial because it deals with a female protagonist, right? Again, thinking about our time period, it's a lot different than the 20th and 21st century here. Because our female protagonist, again, Miss Mallard, feels liberated by the news of her husband's death. So, as we tell, we're going to go through here a little bit. She did have a little bit of tears, but, a lot of folks would say she wasn't necessarily too heartbroken that he was dead. She felt sort of liberated that, now she's going to be able to unbreak these chains, so to speak. And the change could be of that of, again, marriage, right? It could be the chains of a male dominant society. She's able to actually open herself up and be free. The other point that you probably need to kind of keep in mind is that Josephine, who's her sister, really acts as a foil. So if Josephine is really like the modern day woman of that time, right? She represents everything that the 1890s should, what a woman should be in the 1890s. Louise doesn't really like how the women are portrayed or how her life is portrayed in the 1890s. So she's sort of like that new woman, right? She's looking into the future of something better, right? She doesn't just want to be the status quo. She wants more out of her life than just to be, a housewife or a childbearer or, somebody that just sits at home all the time and waits for her husband to come home. She wants something more out of her life. And an interesting note, too, a literary critic, Emily Toth, in her particular work, Unveiling Kate Chopin, has argued that Chopin had to have her heroine die in order to make this particular story publishable. So that's another thing, right? Had Miss Mallory lived after we know what was sort of in her mind, knowing that her husband potentially died, because again, she thought that her husband was dead until we see him again at the very end. That would be sort of troubling in that time period to have somebody, a wife, right, of what folks would say, well, man, she's really evil because she's glad that her husband's dead. She's thinking about all her, all these other things that she could do in her own life. So yeah, it is really sort of it is kind of troubling for some. But I mean, knowing her background a little bit, you could probably kind of understand why she would want something more of a exciting and eventful life than maybe what she had. If we look, right, we have the protagonist again, Miss Mallard. If you notice at the very beginning, she's affected, right, with heart trouble. So that's usually going to sort of key us off, right? We see that right here, sort of foreshadows, because we know that heart comes back. Well, is the heart trouble? Is it something? Is it literal? Is it figurative? It could be a little bit of both, right? There's something going on. But as you can tell too, Josephine and Richards come in and sort of dance around the issue a little bit because they know of her heart issues. They try to, let her down softly about hearing the news that her husband has just recently had a bad accident and has died in this railroad disaster. And you can kind of tell that too, because we see here at the very first, really the second paragraph, I guess you could say, it says, Josephine, who told her in broken sentences, veiled hints that revealed in half concealing. So she's sort of, uneasy. Josephine knows that this news could really impact her sister in a very negative way really fast because of her heart trouble. The other character, right, is the husband, Brantley Mallard, who's assumed dead pretty much the whole entire story until the end, when we hear that his death is merely just, it's been mistaken, right? He comes back into the door, he's still alive. We don't really know too much about him outside of that, we think that he's dead and then he comes back in that last paragraph or so. Some critics and some readers would say, well, if Miss Mallard really didn't have these feelings toward him as much as maybe a wife should back in the 1890s, that there's possibility that maybe Mr. Brantley was abusive. That's true. That could be a possibility, but we just don't know that much about him to really give him that particular label as being, abusive husband and that type deal. I think really what we need to sort of stay focused on is, I don't think it's more or less Miss Mallard hating her husband or saying that he's abusive, because we don't really have any evidence within the text that suggests that. We can, speculate that. But I think really what the deal is, Mr. Mallard represents that whole 1819 male-dominated society that suppresses not only her as a woman, but women in general. So I think that's what she's sort of uneasy about. And that's why when she sort of hears his death, it's like, well, part of that male dominant society has died with him, or at least locally with her, because she's no longer married to that. She'll be able to explore the world a little bit more. as we will tell here momentarily, because, when we look at the story here, we hear that she heard the news about her husband possibly dying, or who she, at the time, everybody thought her husband had died. But you notice the first thing that she sort of did was um, she ran into a room, right? She ran into her own room alone. Now, that could be her bedroom that she shared with her husband. It could be her own, like, personal space. But as you can tell here, it says, when the storm of grief had spent itself, she went away to her room alone. She would have no one follow her. So you think about when somebody close to you has died. Chances are you do want to have a little bit of alone time. You want to have enough time to be able to grieve what you need to grieve, and everybody grieves differently. So, but it's really kind of odd and strange how she didn't want her own sister Josephine to sort of come with her, or at least be close by, because again, sometimes you need that extra family member, whether it's a sibling or whether a mother or father, depending on who's died on you, to come and sort of be comfort. So she goes, right there. She stood facing the open window, a comfortable, roomy air armchair. Into this, she sank, pressed down by physical exhaustion, and hunted her body and seemed to reach into her soul. So she's looking at this open window, right? And one thing that just sort of kind of keep in mind is that open windows mean a lot in literature, especially they're really powerful symbol. They mean, freedom for one, and in this case, for just for Miss Mallard, it's the freedom. She can now open her window. She's not stuck. She's not compressed in this house anymore. She could see, right? She's able to look out and look at the tops of her trees. She's able to, it says, breathe in this new spring of life, right? It says the delicious breath of rain was in the air. In the street below, a peddler was crying his wares, right? So she's able to breathe in, right? Think about after a fresh rain during the springtime, how it smells, right? It's a different smell when it's fresh. It's a different smell after somebody cuts the grass, right? She's able to open that and actually enjoy it. She's actually able to see these patches of blue sky, which we talk somewhat here, also is symbolic for a lot of different reasons. She's able to look out and possibly see, a better world for herself at this point, which is sort of what she wanted, right? She's wanting to get away from this particular moment of being suppressed to a moment where she can actually experience this new womanhood, right? Without any husband or any male sort of dominating her existence at that point. She's hearing the sparrows, right? She's hearing various different songs, right? She's hearing people. She's actually experiencing life beyond what is inside the house. And it's taking her in different paths and different directions, right? If you look to the tone, you would think what the tone of this story would be. What? Well, it's detached, right? We have that detached tone to it. We have that melancholy tone to it. It is sad to some degree, because in one way, in a lot of ways, there's sort of like two deaths going on. There's the death of what we think of her husband, which really, anytime a family member like that would die, you expect to have a little bit more emotion, unless you're just sort of evil and don't care about your significant other. I think she does care to some degree. Whether she really shows that here is doubtful, it's questionable. But I think the other death is the death of her as that 18th, 19th century woman, right? She's ready to break her shell or climb out of her skin into this new form woman. So in some ways, Chopin is actually writing about what would happen in the future, right? What we're seeing in future terms as a woman in the future, in the 20th century, in the 19th century, in the 21st century. That's what Miss Mallard wants to become. She wants to be that 21st or that 20th century woman. She wants to have the freedom to be able to do things on her own without having a male dominant society press her down or have a husband sort of, have the leash on her at all times, if to use that as more of a symbolic or a metaphor. She's wanting to live her own life. At the same time, we see this reaction of Miss Mallard as being cruel of her husband's potential death, right? She doesn't really seem too terribly sad as the piece moves along, right? She's starting to think more about her own new exploration or adventures in life than she does about, well, you know, how are we going to afford their funeral or how are we going to bury Mr. Mallard? So she's sort of detached from that. There's sort of this bitter joy. She comes from her own understanding that she is now free from the shackles of marriage. And we will look at that little piece here momentarily where she comes out and she says, free, 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 right? She likes to use that word. There's a lot of different diction with free or freedom within this particular piece. So and in some way, she's gaining her own independence and freedom that she once was sort of bound by society as a particular wife or as a particular woman of the 18th, 19th century. So if you look here, right, this is a really good descriptive passage. Again, she's sort of in this cushioned chair. She's quite motionless. She's not really, overly, dramatic or, gushing or crying or anything like that over the death of her husband. But we get this really good description of what she sort of looks like at this point. It says she was young with a fair and calm face whose lines bespoke repression. So again, there's that big R word, right? Repression. And even a certain strength. So now you sort of have a contrast, right? You have repression versus a certain strength. Well, she had repression up to that point because of the society that she was a product of or that she lived in. But once she heard of her husband's potential death, now she sort of has certain strength that sort of pulls through, right? Not so much that she's so sad that he has died and, because we don't really get into any of the financial matters. We don't know how much the husband's worth. We don't know if there's, does he have a will? What is going to be left over? And again, as readers, we think that maybe she would be thinking in that way. She being Miss Mallard, because up to that point, I mean, her only job was sort of to be the housekeeper, to be, the childbearer, to be the woman in the house. So we don't even know, or we don't even think she knows what she's going to do once it's time to get out of the house and actually view the world. I mean, what skills does she have? What can she do to sustain herself as far as it relates to getting income? We don't know that. And she's not really thinking of that. She sees this opportunity as being finally free, right? Finally independent of somebody that was what she claims or thinks has been repressing and suppressing her down for a long time. If we go on, it says, but now there was a dull stare in her eyes, whose glaze was fixed away off yonder on one of those patches of blue sky. So again, she's looking out this window. She's sort of daydreaming. She looks at this patch of blue sky. Blue sky, again, if you think of color symbolism, give me a lot of different meanings there. But she's thinking, hey, it's calm. It's peaceful. I have a life now of meaning, of freedom. I'm independent. And if we go on, it says it was not a glance of reflection, but rather indicated a suspension of intelligent thought. So that's kind of interesting because she's not really thinking about the past now. She's not thinking about what happened 2 hours ago or, what she just necessarily heard from the death of her husband. She's not reflecting. She's looking toward this present, this future, right? It's a suspension of her thought, right? She's wondering, what can I do now, right? What are these possibilities that this open window and me staring off into these patches of blue sky have presented me at this point? If we look down, and this is probably the important quotes or portions of the actual story here. When it says, when she abandoned herself, a little whispered word escaped her slightly parted lips. She said it over and over under her breath. Free, free, free. The vacant stare and the look of terror that had followed it went from her eyes. So she's realizing now there's more to life than to be suppressed, right? She doesn't have to rely on a husband at this point anymore. She's wanting to do more. She's wanting to embrace this new woman or this new womanhood. And in some ways, yes, she feels like she is free. But at the same time, that sort of is a scary moment, because up to that point, she's always had a husband or always had some sort of male figure, probably controlling or at least influencing her life. But at this point of what we know, she's able to do a lot of make these decisions now on her own, on her own merit. And for some, that would be sort of it could be, vacant. You might have a vacant stare with that, a terror, right? Because it is new. If you had somebody there always to answer for you, or tell you to do this or do that, now you have the opportunity, oh, I'm free, or at least I feel free. I can answer for my own self now. I don't have to have somebody speak for me. That could be a very traumatic situation as well. It can be met with terror, but it can also be met with happiness. And I think that's sort of where she's at. Going back to that suspension of thought. She's hopeful for the future, but at the same time, I think she's cautious about it too, because she knows she is a woman still in 1890 time frame. If you look, when we talk about person two, when you think about characterization here a little bit, this is really a third person narrative. So if you go back to some of those literary terms I showed you earlier in the video, this would very much fit the third person narrative, because the narrator in this case, and we can just assume the narrator is the person that wrote the story, which would be Chopin, provides access to Louise Mallard's life, right? She provides her medical condition or state. We learn about her strict marriage, her lackluster relationship with her husband, her perspective or point of view on love she has for her husband, and her perspective on her newly awakened ideas of personal freedom, which, Chopin, or the narrator here, really associates with the death of her husband. So we do have a third person narration going on here. We also see that a lot with the third person pronouns that Chopin uses as well. Right? He, she, they, them, their. So pay a close attention to the pronouns that these stories use, and they can kind of tell you, whether you're in a first or second or third person deal, whether it's singular or plural, right? Second person's fairly easy. It's when you use you and your, and first person would be I, me, my, we, that type deal. So if we look to some of the themes here that we have, and again, there's another particular quote that we might look at as well. And it goes here, right? At some point, Josephine, notices that, hey, my sister's been locked in this room for a long period of time. What's going on? And we get sort of this passage here. It says, and yet she had loved him sometimes. And again, this is going back. This is Chopin, right? This third person narrator letting us involve or get us as readers involved ourselves with our protagonist, Louise. And it says that she loved him sometimes, meaning her husband. Often she had not, right? Well, that's sort of cruel to hear, right? Especially since we heard that, Mr. Mallard has suffered a really horrific accident on a railroad. Um, and for her sister or for his wife to basically say, well, she loved him, but sometimes, and often she had not. I mean, that's conflicting there. So that's sort of where we get this theme, right, of marriage versus freedom. Um, because in a lot of ways, Louise Mallard believes that both men and women limit each other in matrimony, right? There's limitations there. If you're a man and you get married, you have some sort of limitations. If you're a woman and get married, you still have some sort of limitations because you're both linked to the other person. And again, we can suspect there's not a lot of proof. There might have been some critics that have written about this. It's something that maybe you can go in and think about when you start thinking about your first essay, maybe. Chopin doesn't really write this story just to basically display how abusive Mr. Mallory is to his wife or vice versa. We don't know any of that aspect. I mean, we don't even know if they have kids or not. We just think that they recently maybe have been married for quite some time. We don't even know how long they've been married. But there's no really evidence that either one of them has been abusive toward the other. But I think really what Chopin is getting at here is that Mallory's narrative really focuses on the individual's inner desires for freedom. Lewis' desires for freedom far exceed her love for Mr. Mallard. And it's a controversial idea that goes against norms of the 18th and 19th century during that time. So if you look to, going back to this particular passage, it says, what did it matter? Who could love the unsolved mystery, count for in the face of this possession of self-assertion, which she suddenly recognized as the strong impulse of her being? It's like there's something trying to transform her. It's like it's trying to get out of her very body, mind, and soul, it seems. And we sort of get that here where it says free, body, soul, free. She kept whispering. And again, at this point, this is where her sister comes in. Josephine was kneeling before the closed door with her lips to the keyhole, imploring for admission. Louise, open the door. I beg, open the door. You'll make yourself ill. What are you doing, Louise? For heaven's sakes, open the door. And of course, we have another very important passage that we're going to look at here when the sister exchanges back and says, go away. I'm not making myself ill. No, she was drinking in a very exular of life through that open window. So it's that opening window that's really giving her that extra boost. It's giving that extra energy, right? The spring. Again, she's seeing all this stuff. Now, the spring, it could be March, it could be April, it could be May. But the spring in this case really symbolizes a new beginning, which represents life. That is what she thinks she's going to be gaining as being a widow now. Now, a lot of folks would, especially in the 20th and 21st century, if a husband or a spouse dies and you become widow, you're not thinking that, hey, you're gaining life back or you're gaining something because you are a widow. Usually you're in mourning. You're not really gaining anything. But for Miss Mallard here, it's something different. If we notice too, thinking about the season, spring comes after winter. So if you think winter is the time of, when her marriage was sort of still intact, winter also means cold and death and that type deal. When we have this spring, by her opening up the door, we see something new for her. It is a newer adventure, a newer lifestyle, a newer life that that's coming for possibly bring her good things. We know, again, going back to her heart, when we basically get to the very end of the story, really the last paragraph or so, it says someone was opening the front door with a latch key. And of course, again, anything, being a husband, being a male during that 18th, 19th century, you would have the key, right? You wouldn't have the wife or the girlfriend wouldn't have the key. It would always be the male. It was Brantley Mallard who entered. A little traveled strain, supposedly carried his grip sack and umbrella. He had been far from the scene of the accident and did not even know there had been one. He stood amazed at Josephine's piercing cry, at Richard's quick motion to screen him from the view of his wife. But Richard was too late. When the doctors came, they said she had died of heart disease. Oh, joy that kills. So again, this deal about her heart, right? She had some sort of heart failure or heart problem. You get that the very first sentence, and it sort of comes back at the very last sentence. So again, this sort of classic line of joy that kills. We won't really, nobody can never know the overwhelming emotional stress of seeing her husband come back, or was it maybe the overwhelming emotional stress of knowing that since he's back, there's no way I can divorce myself from him and from male dominant society because he hasn't died. I can't divorce him. I'm no longer a widow. I'm still a wife. So seeing his face pop back in to her life has sort of just really disrupted everything, right? She has lost this sense of hope for her own future now. She can no longer, transform into this new woman that she wants to become. And that's sort of ironic too, in some ways, because it was, those around her, Josephine, her husband, Richards, the doctors, they, think it's a heart attack. They think it's, heart disease. I'm sure that had something to do with it, but I think she was in shock that, hey, she realizes her fortune of becoming this new woman has sort of, disappeared by seeing him return, her husband, that is, return back to her life. We do have this sort of theme or bigger theme when you think about it of women's liberation movement. And again, going back, it shows that Miss Mallory or Mallard was a housewife who had been confined to the social norms of the obedient wife, has an unorthodox reaction to the death of her husband. Again, she doesn't really cry as much. She shed a couple maybe crocodile tears, enough to give appearances, but then she rushes herself off to be in her own little private space, right? She basically closes the door on anything that represents the 1890s, the 18th century, the 19th century, which would be one, Josephine, right? She's sort of the stock or the status quo of what a woman should be like. And Richards, in some ways, he's like the status quo or the stock male figure of what 1890 or 19th century males should act like too. Over this death of what she thought, her husband had really died in this railroad accident, she anticipates her newfound freedom from the suppression of her husband, of men, basically, a male dominant society. And this is really one of those things too. It's really a key idea of the values of the feminist movement, right? Male suppression, male, repression, that type deal. You don't necessarily have to really agree to it if you're not really more of a feminist. But it's one of those big, important pieces of feminist work right here as it relates to a short story. Because what it's doing is, at the time in the 1890s, it's showing a woman, that being Miss Mallard. And in some ways, an extension, it's showing that Miss Mallard and Chopin, Kate Chopin, are sort of similar in a lot of ways, because Kate Chopin did break barriers here as well. She's wanting to break from this normal society that, male has to be the dominant, component there. She's wanting to move past that. She's wanting to sort of have really, I think she's wanting equality for both. A lot of feminists will look at it being that, she's tired of being suppressed. Um, and I think she is. She's wanting something more of her own. I don't think she's wanting to go out and be, like most feminists would say, she just wants to, damn all men and all that stuff. I don't think she wants to do all that. I think she just wants to have the ability to do her own thing, right? And she doesn't feel like she's having that ability to do her own thing. There is a film adaptation of it. You might be able to find it on YouTube. It might be good to sort of take a look at maybe. It's sort of dated. It's back in 1984. It's called The Joy That Kills. And it's really part of the PBS series of American Playhouse. So if you're able to find find that on YouTube or something, that might be something good to watch to sort of, go through the story after you read it. You can sort of see it in action. I think I tried to find a version of it at one point, and the quality of the video really wasn't all that great, but you might be able to find something a little bit better than I did. And it might be useful, again, if you're wanting something to sort of just give you the high notes on the themes and the characterization and that type stuff. Because this story is relatively short, right? It's only about a page in your book. In this particular online site, I think it's like 2.5 pages. So it's something that you can read multiple times. If need be. It's not like it's 50 or 60 pages. But the video, if you could find a video, would be helpful too, because it would just drive home some stuff. Let's look back real quick, and I'm going to try to finish this up a little bit, because you do have the slideshows that you can kind of look at for Chopin, which is really good. You got some teaching notes, which again, a lot of the stuff, maybe what I've talked about, is going to be sort of rehatched in the slideshows and in these teaching notes. So that's just going to be more, enforcement, more enrichment, to see it and read it and hear it more than, one time. It sort of stays in your mind. If we look at the fiction exam or the fiction essay, let's pull that up real quick. And again, we may talk a little bit more. We'll probably talk a lot more about this as the weeks go on, especially since you have 5 weeks to do it. Let's see, pull it up here. Yeah. Okay. So I'm going to blow this up. And basically, you're doing a close reading essay. And I'll give you some, additional material about close reading in the weeks to come. But really, because you're only reading a really short story of Chopin, and the Hemingway story is relatively short. It's not as short as the Chopin story, but you only really have 2 stories this week. So this is really building on the stories that we were looking at, right? I do give you a topic that deals with each one of the stories that we've read. So if you look, number 1 and number 2 deal with the stories of week 1. Number 3 and number 4 do deal with the stories of week 2. 5 and 6 would deal with the stories of week 3. 7 would deal with the story of week 4. And then I give you a choice of if you read the first 7 of these topics, you don't like them, you have something in mind that you want to do, I would suggest that you email me, talk to me about it at some point before you really get started, because I just want to make sure that you're doing on one of the stories that we did read, and I want to see what sort of your plan is going from page 1 to page 2 to page 3. I just want to make sure that you have enough that you're going to make the assignment worthwhile, that it's going to be doable, that you're going to get the best possible grade out of it. So as you can tell here, these are sort of the guidelines. It's going to be due on September the 25th. If you notice, that's a Friday. I may move that up. I may make it that Sunday. I just have to see how things go. But for right now, we're just going to leave it the 25th. It won't be due before the 25th. So it's either going to be, it's going to be that particular weekend that it's going to be due. There will be a Dropbox in that particular week's folder, which would be that week 5 folder, that you would just basically make sure that you save your Microsoft Word document and then you upload. There'll be instructions how to, go through it. Most of y'all probably have used the Dropbox where you have to upload a Microsoft Word document. It's going to be similar to that. You want to follow all MLA 8 guidelines as it relates to styling the paper, right? Times New Roman 12 font, double space, everything, 1-inch margins around. The length of the paper needs to be 4 to 5 pages or 1,000 to 1,250 words, whatever comes first. So if you get 1,000 words and you're on page 3, but you feel like you covered everything you need to cover, then you can stop. If you get to page 4, or if you get to page 3 and you're not at 1,000 words, then you need to go to at least page 4. So again, 4 to 5 pages, 1,000 words, 1,250. The length and the word count is there for a lot of reasons, because if I don't give you a page, count or a word count or whatever, I'm going to get a lot of essays or so-called essays that are only going to be 2 pages. And if you look at some of these topics, you can't really write a good close reading in just 2 pages. But at the same time, I would rather read a really jammed up 3-page paper than a really shoddy 5-page paper. So again, be careful. You want to make every word count, because anybody can, write 5 pages, but really not tell me anything. So just use common sense about it. If you need to go 4 or 5 pages, go to 4 or 5 pages. If you think you can, say everything you can say in 3 pages and it's 1,000 words, then give me 3 pages. Again, you want to probably send me drafts throughout the next 5 weeks. That would be helpful. You probably want to send Smart Thinking some drafts. That would probably be helpful too. I would probably send Smart Thinking drafts before you sent me drafts. And if you know anybody in the class, or you want to go, through the email, I think you could go through your Blackboard email and send an email out to various class members. If you want to send somebody a draft of your paper and sort of have a buddy system set up, you can do that as well. And again, probably in week 2 and week 3, you're going to have a little bit more information on what does it really mean to closely read. And usually you're looking at those elements, right? That's sort of the reason why I gave you that that PDF file and that we looked at earlier about the elements of fiction. You're looking at plot, you're looking at images, you're looking at motifs, you're looking at symbols, you're looking at characterization. So you're sort of dissecting a particular part of the work, right? Or in this case, you're taking this topic and you're sort of going through that particular story and dissecting whatever this particular topic's want you to dissect. So don't think that you have to go to Galileo or any of the databases. You do not have to use any secondary resources. It's just, I just want your opinion, and I want your opinion backed up with support, textual evidence, meaning quotes from that particular short story that you're using. So it's just going to be you and the text. You should defend, right, your point of view with quotations from that particular text, right? One way of not doing really well on this paper is just sort of giving me, well, I like the story, blah, 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 and saying that in basically 4 or 5 pages, but not really quoting from Story of an Hour, not really giving me quotes from Soldier Home. Right? You're not backing up your points with actual points that the story has made with, various quotations and that type stuff. And we'll talk a little bit about how to go about properly quoting short stories. If you wrote a research paper in 1101, you already know how to quote prose writing. And when we think of short stories, that is prose writing. So again, week 2, we'll probably talk a little bit more about this in detail, maybe look at some more of the topics here. But I just wanted to point that out. You can read the topics as we get, again, take topic 1 and 2 as week 1, 3, 4, week 2, 5, 6, week 3, 7, week 4, and then 8, sort of a combination of all the weeks. So again, we haven't made it to week 2 or 3 yet. So if you start looking at these topics and like, well, what is he talking about here? Well, if you haven't read the works for week 2 or 3 yet, you're not really going to understand what I mean by those yet. So try not to get too far ahead, but this is something to sort of keep in mind. I let you look at it now. So when you start to read some of these these works in the weeks to come, you can have something already in mind and say, hey, that looks like, week 3 talks about the yellow wallpaper, and that's one of the topics, and that looks something I may be interested in doing. So you already have some, start brainstorming, taking notes, annotating the text while you're reading the text that week. All right, so probably what we're going to do is I'm going to end it there because it's going on almost an hour here. I think we covered a good bit. I think our next little thing on Wednesday, because like I said, I did send out some stuff via Teams. Check your emails, check your Blackboards for that. Again, it's not really a mandatory live lecture meeting. If you can make it, great. I know some of y'all probably work during that time. It's at this point, Mondays and Wednesdays in particular, will probably be the days that I do those live lectures. And I will say I do have a class at the Golden House campus from 8 o'clock to 9:20. But if, the time from 4 to 5:30 doesn't work for everybody, if you have another time after 9:30 that would work, just email me, and I'll, look at the majority. If everybody's saying, hey, I can do it from 4 to 5:30, we just keep that time. I can be flexible a little bit of that on Wednesday, because again, I think on Mondays I'm going to try to do some of these videos. So to give you a chance to have videos, give you an opportunity to look through the actual weekly folder for the documents and the other slideshows, and then toward the middle of the week, where we can have maybe live discussions to pick up maybe what we don't cover in the Monday's videos. And like I said, we didn't really talk about the Hemingway short story, but we can talk about that on Wednesday. And again, if there's not a lot of people that show up, I will still record and do sort of a little lecture on the Hemingway piece and upload that or send that out to everybody. So just let me know if there's a better time on Wednesday after 9:30 that would work for everybody for live lecture meetings. If not, we're going to sort of just keep it from 4 to 5:30. And I know it's a little bit more. When you do the Teams meeting setup, you can't really just set it for like a 75-minute lecture. It has to. It's either 30-minute, an hour 30, in those increments like that. So don't feel like you have to stay the whole hour and 30 minutes. Obviously, if you got another class or you got to go pick up kids or you got to go to work, I understand. But we will try to keep those, within a 60 to 75 minutes time frame, unless there's just not a whole lot to discuss that week. If it's more or less talk a little bit about a story and then a lot more questioning and answering, we can do that as well. But just let me know. Like I said, I could be flexible. I just need to know from you what would work for everybody's schedule. But for right now, the 4 to 5:30 aspect works well in my schedule, especially on Wednesdays, because Tuesdays and Thursdays I'm pretty much all day in Camden. So I don't think that's going to work out too well for any live lectures. Monday and Wednesday, if we have to, switch, we can do it on Monday and do these videos on Wednesday. We can do that too if need be. All right. Well, I hope everybody has a good first week, at least for Monday, Tuesday, and I hope to see or hear from everybody on Wednesday. If you need to, email me or call me. I will be back in touch. Thanks.